Legal disclaimer. Bespoke Group investment advisory services are offered only through Bespoke Advisory, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Everything we share here is just for information and education. It's not investment, legal, or tax advice. Bespoke does not offer or solicit investment services to the general public. And as always, investing comes with risk, including the possible loss of principal. Thank you both for joining us. So I want to set the scene a little bit, which is that the global order is changing. This is something that I think by now we're like all aware of. Like there's been a lot of talk. So I don't want to dwell too much on the obvious. But you know, people are wanting optionality. They're looking at plan B and C and D as a way to manage risk. And, you know, Judi, your seat at the table is your, helping that process get started with clients who, finding the right strategy with them and guiding them through that. And then the ongoing maintenance of what that takes. And Sune, you sit at a side of a table where, you're both experiencing this influx, this interest from different seats. But then there's interplay and there's connection there, because what Judi does is a piece of the full, the full scope of somebody's wealth. And so I'm hoping that today we can kind of explore this from both of your positions, because they are very connected. Judi, I wanted to ask you, I was listening to your other podcasts and I noticed how you were saying that, there's literally, the statistics are showing that it's American applications and interest in Plan B options are there's 1,000%, increase. And that 2020 was really the launch into this kind of new era, I think, for upper high net worth folks, in terms of residency and citizenship by investment. But I'd love to hear from you what change you're seeing maybe now. Like, where are we now, in comparison to maybe 2020 and 2024? Where are we now?
I can tell you that I did 3 times the amount of business last year than I did the year before, and that I have not seen any kind of let up in terms of the demand of wealthy families wanting to understand what their options are. I mean, not everybody that I speak to goes through with pursuing an alternative residence or citizenship, but there's just extraordinary interest among Americans, particularly, to sort of understand what is available to me via investment migration or citizenship by ancestry. It's such a new concept, really, to people from developed countries. The whole concept of investment migration really started with people in emerging markets, and they had very different motivations. They were more inclined to relocate. I'm not seeing my clients leave the United States. In fact, almost every conversation starts out the same way. I don't want to leave the United States. They just want to know that they can. They want to know that they have a guaranteed route, that if at some point in the future, either for themselves or perhaps for their future generations, they have a way for them to be able to go to another part of the world for as long or as short as they want. But emerging markets were more inclined to relocate, partially because they weren't taxed on worldwide wealth. And so one of their big strategies often was they would relocate to a more favorable tax jurisdiction in order to save money on taxes. But that's not a play for Americans. So we're always going to be taxed on our U.S. wealth. It's either us and Eritrea are the only 2 countries that do that. So what I focus on with Americans is not driven by taxes. But emerging markets, yes, that's a motivator. Another motivator that they had was that they had a weak passport. So it was very difficult for them to travel. They couldn't get into Europe. They always had to get a Schengen visa. So they were looking for solutions that would gain them Schengen access or greater mobility. Again, United States, we have a very strong passport. Very easy for us to travel. So that's not a motivation. But what's really driving it is people that just want to mitigate the risk that they feel in an unsettled world by having options.
Yeah, I was reading your one of you do excellent research on a lot of these statistics and have become somewhat of a resource, and we get to collaborate sometimes on some of those pieces. But I was reading a recent report, I think, where I was quoting like 165,000 millionaires are relocating in 2026, based on your sort of whatever input those are. And that is like the largest private wealth migration in at least the time Henley has been around, which is now an extended period of time. And it is that interesting window where we've shifted to this becoming much more common. I think even in my practice working with wealthy families, I think there was certainly early days where it was kind of like a sort of James Bond or Jason Bourne kind of who comes with the suitcase with multiple passports, and it was kind of an interesting area, but it was certainly on the edge, and there was not really much sort of interest in it, specifically because in a US context, there's not really a tax play in terms of residency or passports in different places. But it seems that we have had this significant shift in the perception of it, and obviously the optionality within it. I don't know, Henley has been on the forefront of developing a lot of these different jurisdictions. I think from my perspective, I'm curious from your lens, just kind of what is kind of the global trend really? You mentioned obviously US, there's been a lot of interest, but obviously people leave one place to go to another place. I'll be interested in kind of the dynamics within different regions, different countries, and maybe you can speak a little bit to some of the recipients or the areas you're seeing a lot of interest in.
Sure. So it's so interesting because, here I am. My focus is primarily dealing with Americans who want to mitigate risk by having options, but like people all around the world have that same motivation. I mean, we now are hearing from a lot of people that are in UAE, that had gone there for the tax jurisdiction, that now want to have another option because they're feeling unsettled with what's going on there. We have people that are close to the border of the war with Ukraine and Russia who also are feeling that they want to have options. We have people that are in the UK that one are facing, change in tax policy, but two are frustrated with Brexit that they lost their EU access. So they're looking for options. And we still have a lot of people that want to come into the United States that are doing the EB-5 program, or they are curious about this Trump gold card and whether that's going to be a pathway for them. So it's so interesting because no matter where people are in the world, it seems to be just a common thread among wealthy families to sort of have optionality.
Yeah. Judi, I was thinking earlier about how like the world is a scary place, and we're I think like there's kind of a peek behind the curtain, I think, for maybe Americans that more than there ever has been. And I thought to myself, I was like, just because I might be getting a little abstract here, but I'd love it if you'd meet me there. Like, you know, someone gets a passport to another country, like you have no idea, you say that you could be planning for 25 years down the line, but like who's to say what the, economic or political situation is going to be in that country? I mean, to your example of how you're seeing shifts now for folks in the other direction. So just interesting to contemplate that. I think that the reality is that optionality is important, but even having the options can't create like a full level of certainty.
Sure. No, that's actually true. I mean, I know Sune had asked a little bit about what I'm seeing in terms of popular destinations, and I'm going to mention that in 1 minute. But one common thing that happens is people say, like, if things are so unsettled, I would actually contemplate leaving the United States. They often like Europe, but they think, like, is it going to be any better in Europe? I mean, if things are so bad, and that's where New Zealand comes in. So, you know, it is true that many people don't just get a plan B. They get a C and a D, because they want to diversify what's available to them. But I can speak, specifically to what most American clients are interested in right now. And then if you want to mention other regions, I can tell you a little bit more about what people in those countries might be thinking of. But I would say from the perspective of Americans, there's really sort of three baskets that I end up talking about a lot. One is Caribbean citizenship. And a lot of people be like, why would I want to have Caribbean citizenship? But there are not a lot of routes to citizenship. There are many more routes to residency. And actually, maybe let me take a step back and explain the difference because people listening may not be aware of what the difference is. Residency gives you the ability to live in one specific country. So as I said, U.S. passport's very strong. We can go to a lot of different countries without getting a visa, but we can't stay there forever. For example, we can go into Europe for 90 days, then we have to leave for 90 days, then we can go back in for another 90 days. So if you were to become a legal resident of a country in, say, Europe, Italy, Greece, Portugal, Malta, you could live there 12 months a year. But it's not permanent unless there's a path to permanent residency, and there are some programs that have that. So it's akin to what Americans know of as having a green card, essentially. So you do have to usually maintain certain requirements in order to keep it. It could be, in this case, maintaining your investment, whether you invested in real estate to get a Greek golden visa. If you sell that real estate, you're not going to be able to renew it. If you invested in venture capital or private equity to get a Portugal golden visa, if you liquidate your investment, you're not going to be able to renew it. So there are usually conditions. It can be to maintain an investment. It could be to spend a certain amount of time in that country. Although what's nice is the vast majority of programs I do require very little time in the country in order to have the ability to live there unlimited. But most importantly, it usually has to be renewed. So it's not a permanent right. And some people feel unsettled with that. They want something that's more of a lifelong right. And that's what citizenship is. It's very hard to take away someone's citizenship. The other big difference is that when you become a citizen of a country, you get a passport. So in addition to having the ability to live and work in the country that you're a citizen of, you also have another mobility option that allows you to travel into a lot of other places. It's often a strategy for someone with a weak passport to get a citizenship in a country with a stronger passport, because all of a sudden they can start to go to more countries without having to get a visa. And where citizenship's incredibly powerful is in Europe, because if you become the citizen of one country in the EU, you can live and work in any country in the EU. And that's what I see like very attractive to families, people that are thinking about protecting generational legacy and opportunity, because they want to know that their kids can look for work in many other parts of the world, 27 countries in Europe, live, work, have global opportunities. Maybe it's going to help them expand their businesses globally. So that was just a quick segue to make sure that everyone understood the difference between residence and citizenship. And I'll go back to the Caribbean, which is one of the areas that I do find people are interested in. So one, it's a citizenship. It's a guaranteed right. Two, it's going to give you a passport, which is actually right now pretty strong, although I'm not sure if the strength of the Caribbean passports is always going to remain, but right now they are quite strong. Also very fast and very affordable. And they have very expansive rules in terms of who can be included in a family application. So ages of children can have a big impact on how many investments someone has to make in order to gain residency or citizenship rights. And in the Caribbean, there's a lot of flexibility. So for example, at Antigua, you can include kids up to age 30 without showing financial dependency. So for someone with adult children, it can be a very good option for them. So seeing good interest in the Caribbean. Admittedly, people don't want to go live their lives there, though. So, you go into it with the perspective, not a bad place to go to have a good time with the family. If there was some temporary reason I wanted to leave the United States, like during a pandemic, and I wanted to go somewhere else, Caribbean would be a good place. I got another passport I can travel on, but it's not somewhere you're necessarily going to ultimately relocate to if the world were to really change in some way. The other area, still a lot of interest in Europe. More residency options than citizenship options. But from a residency perspective, I'd say Portugal, Greece, Italy, and Malta are all popular. Portugal was historically very popular, but there have been some changes in Portugal that are making, I think, a little less attractive. And then from a citizenship perspective, it's really interesting what's happened in Europe. So there used to be well-defined citizenship by investment programs in Europe. Cyprus had one. Malta was probably the most well-known citizenship by investment program. And Europe didn't like this. Europe felt that these citizenship by investment programs were essentially selling a passport, very transactional, to people that didn't show a tie to a country. And in 2022, they sued Malta over this. And it wound its way through the courts. And in 2025, even though the EU Advocate General, which is the highest lawyer in Europe, found in Malta's favor, the court, the High Court, European Court of Justice, ruled Malta's citizenship by investment program illegal. And that essentially ended citizenship by investment programs in Europe because they were illegal. So no country in Europe can now have a citizenship by investment program, nor can any country that wants to get into the EU, because that would probably blow up their chances of getting invited to be a member. But
Wow.
what countries are doing is they are relying on longstanding provisions in their constitution that allow them to grant citizenship to exceptional people that will make an exceptional contribution to their country. It's known as citizenship by merit. So there still are pathways to citizenship in Europe. They are different. And the two countries that are probably most well known for it now are Malta and Austria. So again, still strong interest in Europe. And then I would say I'm seeing very strong interest in New Zealand. A lot of why is because of what I said earlier. Like, if things aren't so great in the US, they might not be so great in Europe. Yes, New Zealand's very far away, but maybe that's a good thing. English speaking, good healthcare, good education, and purely investment driven. And so very appealing for a high net worth family.
Can you give me some examples of what citizenship by merit, like how that is vetted? Because this might steer us into something I was thinking about, which is that, um, at Bespoke, we align like the investment approach and the giving and philanthropic approach are very much aligned to the client's values and operating under I would say a similar umbrella, and that relationship is very important. And so I was thinking to myself, like, as I was kind of preparing for this conversation, I was like, wow, is there such thing as like citizenship or residency by giving and
Mhm.
philanthropy? And I wonder if maybe falls in this category.
It does absolutely fall in that category, with the one caveat that these gifts are not tax deductible. So, yes, I mean, not every family is only making philanthropic gifts because of the tax deduction, but you have to be aware that you are going to be making a large gift that is essentially just a gift. But they are going to wonderful projects. So let's dive into Malta by Merit. That's a good one for me to demonstrate how citizenship by merit works. First thing is we have to have a narrative about the client. They can't just be wealthy. They can't just have been successful in business. They have to have been meritorious. And having been historically philanthropic is typically how we check that box. I mean, yes, they could be an athlete or an entertainer that would make them exceptional just by virtue of what they've done in their life. But most of our clients are investors or entrepreneurs, um, and they tend to be philanthropic people that are wealthy in the United States, fortunately. So we need to have a narrative. If they just inherited gobs of money and have never done anything to better the world, they're not going to be able to pursue the program. And we have had clients in those circumstances. They just had no narrative. Also, very difficult for someone very young to have a narrative that will, you know, justifiably demonstrate that they are meritorious at a young age. Um, so that's the first thing. In the past citizenship by investment programs, clients made a large gift to Malta, but it went to the Maltese economy. It didn't go to a well-defined project. Now, via citizenship by merit, clients are still making a large gift, but they are to projects, and they are wonderful projects. I mean, it could be building a sensory park for disabled children. It could be building an arts center at the university. It could be a project that's helping to clean the oceans. So we are really able to understand our clients' passions and align them with giving that feels good to them. And the third big difference between a sort of a standard citizenship by investment program and a citizenship by merit program is that clients need to show a continued tie to the country for a period of at least 5 years after the citizenship is granted. So in Malta, you probably will be granted citizenship under 2 years, probably around 16 months or so after we start working with the client. But for 5 years after that, the clients have to show ties to the country. And that can go in a lot of different directions. It's going to mean holding real estate in the country for the full 7 years. But it's also going to be, how can that applicant contribute to Malta? And there are a lot of different directions this can take based on what the client's willing to do and interested in doing. So I have some clients that, they're in their retirement years and they're happy to go to Malta for a couple weeks every year and get involved in charities that speak to them and to volunteer. And I have other people that are leading very, very busy lives. And so they would rather do more ties that can be handled remotely. So it could be that they're going to be on boards of the museum, or they're going to be guest lecturers at the university, or they are going to consult with entities that they can bring experience, or they run a business and they're going to bring students from Malta to do summer internships there. There's so many different directions it can take, but those continued ties are really, really important. But to answer your question, these can be viewed as philanthropic endeavors, just with the caveat that they're not tax deductible.
It's actually a good segue to a question we started to work more with the athlete entertainer space, and I was kind of interested in just getting maybe some trends and some of the things you see that actually works. Obviously, I know for US athletes, most of them, unless they're in some of these sort of edge sports like golf or like Formula One, they tend to be working in the US sports leagues, and so a little bit difficult to use this and to the point about taxation for a US citizen. But in terms of kind of the athlete entertainer space, besides sort of driven by the wanting to have the backup passport, but really more about how to think about it as part of an integrated setup for them, their operating businesses, so they're sort of where they have their image rights, etc., and their team. What are some, I know places like Monaco and Switzerland has historically been places, but what are you seeing in kind of the athlete entertainer space as jurisdictions and solutions?
Yeah, we actually created sort of a niche business just for athletes and entertainers. And there's some interesting options that are available to athletes and entertainers that are not available to, just the typical client, because many countries are very attracted to having these kinds of people be citizens or residents. And I'll give a couple of examples. For example, Australia has a talent visa, which is no cost, which I've done not a number, but I've done a handful of, songwriters, producers, other Hollywood executives have taken advantage of this, as well as people in private equity that have expertise in segments that are important, considered talents that Australia wants to attract. And the nice thing about this is that they deem you sort of worthy of this visa type. There's no cost to it. Now, it's a visa that's permanent residency for 5 years, but they're not going to renew it if you don't contribute to Australian society. So that might mean that my producer is going to shoot a show there, or that, one of my private equity people is going to open a business there. But it's an interesting option, and also like another layer on. Like I have a client doing Malta, and he definitely would also qualify for Australia. He's like, fine, do both of them hand in hand. With regard to your question specifically about jurisdictions for athletes and entertainers, again, people outside of the United States can look at this a lot from a tax perspective. And so typically they are interested in a Monaco or a Malta or a UAE, where there's not a tax on worldwide wealth. Also, for athletes that are from countries with weak passports, this can be a strategy for them just to ease their ability to be able to compete well, because there can be visa-related issues and challenges to be able to enter certain jurisdictions for people with weak passports. So we've had people that have pursued a program just to enable them to travel easier in conjunction with their sport. We've had people who have had children who want to be on teams internationally, but they will only take a certain percentage of people from, say, the United States. So they get a dual citizenship to make them more appealing to be able to compete internationally and to get on certain teams that they might be precluded from because of their country being only a citizen of their country of origin. So there's lots of really interesting things with regard to athletes and entertainers. One other one that I'll mention is Austria, which is the other citizenship by merit program in Europe. Again, the power of an EU passport is significant because you can live and work anywhere in Europe. And the Austria program is usually appealing to a very small niche because the contribution amount is 3.5 million euros, which is a lot. but there's a carve out for athletes and entertainers at a much lower contribution amount of about 1.5 million or 1 million euros, depending upon who they are. And that really makes it in line sort of with Malta, with less of the um, financial disclosures and other elements that come with the Malta program. So there are definitely some interesting options for sports, you know, sports people and entertainers that are not available to the general public.
Very interesting. You touched on investment and kind of skill-based options. I think you mentioned ancestry, which is something I've seen growing in
Mhm.
interest, particularly for Americans and Canadians to some degree. But can you speak a little bit just ancestry? I know it can be
Sure.
complicated and has a lot of different chains to it, but I know that you specifically, I think you personally have been exploring this, but I think it's
I
something that you
am.
guys are doing
I
more work
am.
on. Can you speak a little bit to ancestry? Because I get a lot of questions about that.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is part of almost any consultation I have with a client, because if you couldn't gain EU citizenship, which again, super powerful, the ability to live and work in any country in the EU, if you can gain it by ancestry, you should do it, because Malta, you're going to be 1.8 million euros out of pocket. Austria, you're going to be 4 million euros out of pocket. So if you can qualify via the fact that you have a direct descendant from another country, it's worth looking at. Now, it's not as easy as it sounds. Every country has its own laws about who is eligible, and it can be complicated. It can go back, just to the parent. It can go to the grandparent. It can go to the great grandparent. It's going to vary. There are going to be factors like whether there was a break in the bloodline. Did that relative naturalize in another country and renounce the citizenship of the country that you're trying to get? But what we do, because it is very complicated, is we have relationships with attorneys in 9 different countries, the ones where we felt the mass, the most amount of Americans are from. So it's Austria, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Romania, Ireland. I'm at 7. There might be 2 others, but I can't think of them. Um, who we can assess whether there is a route and then refer to the lawyer who would be able to handle the application. I mean, you do need to have documents. I've had clients that have called me, they did 23andMe and they think they're like a certain percentage Irish. I'm like, that's not gonna be enough. My
Yeah.
funniest one was someone sent me a photo of their grandfather in like an army uniform. I think it's a German uniform. I'm like, no, like, do you know his
A
name?
bit
Do you
more.
know like where he lived? So you do need to know some information, but you are right. I just actually went through the process for myself for Germany, and I was naturalized 6 weeks ago.
Oh my gosh.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Germany and Austria are countries that have laws that say if you have a direct descendant that fled due to Nazi persecution, you and all future generations are entitled to citizenship. And I was able to qualify from that because my grandparents fled Nazi Germany and my brothers did it and all our kids did it. And my friends are like, "What about the German passport?" But I'm like, people, I think, don't really understand the power of an EU passport. I
Right.
mean, the ability for my kids to go work in Europe is really significant. Not to mention the EU line at the airport. But
Yeah. What are a few other misconceptions about this process? I know that sometimes people think that like you're going to lose your current citizenship, and I think there are other kind of a handful of reasons where people are like, I can't do it because of X, Y, and Z.
yeah. So there are definitely a couple common misconceptions which are good for us to dive into. One is I have to renounce. So the US does not restrict the number of citizenships an American can have. Although there is someone in Congress that's trying to challenge that, but I
Yeah, I was
don't
going
think,
to say, is that subject to change?
well, anything is subject to change these days. But I think most constitutional scholars feel that that's not going to happen, but you can't say anything with certainty these days. So you don't have to renounce. And in fact, I don't know if you've ever had a client, Sune, that renounced. It's a really expensive process for a high net worth
Mm.
person, and a complicated one, and one that limits your ability to spend time in the United States where you may have family. So it's n- uncommon from my perspective. I've actually never had a client renounce, but of course, if you are considering renouncing, you absolutely need me because you get shouldn't become stateless. So we should at
No.
minimum get you a Caribbean passport or something before you take that step. So one thing you do have to be careful of is you don't want to get a passport or citizenship from a country that doesn't recognize dual citizenship with the United States. And there are some countries that are still very restrictive of the ability to gain multiple citizenships. I mean, notably, Spain does not recognize dual citizenship with the U.S. Panama does not. The Netherlands does not. So what does that mean? I mean, it means that when they grant you your citizenship, they're going to potentially expect you to sign something saying, this is my only citizenship. Now, by signing that, you're not renouncing your U.S. citizenship, but like most people wouldn't want to sign that, knowing that the governments do not
Right.
want that. So that is something you have to think about. But in terms of people that are just U.S. citizens, I mean, all the programs that I offer would recognize dual citizenship with the U.S. The second question is, do I need to relocate? Like if I become a resident of another country, do I have to go live there or spend a lot of time there? And the vast majority of the programs that are out there require very little physical presence. You're always going to have to go to get biometrics, fingerprints. But in many cases, you never have to go back again until you have to renew. Some have some minimal physical presence. Portugal requires you to do 14 days every 2 years, as long as you're a resident. New Zealand wants you to spend, the main applicant has to spend 21 days. You have 3 years to spend 21 days in New Zealand. Everyone else has to go for 1 day to activate the visa. But there's no need to relocate for the vast majority of these programs. In most cases, you can spend little to no time there, but you could also live there. Now, one of the things that's important for an American to think about is becoming a tax resident. So a lot of people are like, does this mean I'm going to pay double tax? Because as an American, we're always going to pay our U.S. tax. And that's a good question. And I'm not licensed to give tax advice, but I'm going to talk about it from a high level here. You don't become a tax resident automatically by becoming a resident or a citizen of another country, unless that country is the United States or Eritrea. So by becoming a resident of a country in Europe or by becoming a citizen in the Caribbean or even a citizen in Europe, you're not becoming a tax resident. But you can trigger tax residency. And usually that happens when you spend some significant time in the country. For most of Europe, it's 183 days or more in a year. Switzerland, it's 90 days. New Zealand, it's 183 days in a 12-month period. So this is something you do have to be aware of. And we do have tax experts in every country where I do a program. So if you want to do a tax consult to sort of understand what it might mean, we will always facilitate that. So like some people will say to me like, yeah, I want to become an EU citizen, but it's because I want to move to Spain. Well, Spain's a highly taxed country. So we absolutely, if that's your objective, even though by becoming an EU citizen, you're not becoming a tax resident anywhere. But if you really see yourself spending a lot of time in Spain, you need to understand what that's going to mean for you. Now, just by becoming a tax resident isn't necessarily doom and gloom because there could be a tax treaty. There could be transitional tax where you're not taxed on worldwide wealth for a certain number of years. There could be a flat tax. So it doesn't mean you're going to pay double tax. It doesn't mean it's going to be bad, but it does mean you need to understand it if you think you're going to trigger tax residency.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting place where our worlds have overlapped and how we often collaborate, which is, so while you are absolutely right, I think many are exploring the plan B, C, D currently and wanting that optionality. And in our scope of services, that has always manifested itself in having international structures. So again, jurisdictional, but often thought through different lenses. And sometimes with an overlap with the idea that having a structure, a business, a piece of real estate in a structure and a jurisdiction may lead to residency or access to that country. But in the structural sense, rarely that is the primary when we build sort of operating systems for wealthy families. Then the other piece has been actually having wealth, so private banking, real estate, other things in other jurisdictions, and how to think about that within the context of sort of comprehensive planning. And most of our clients are US citizens, and I've only come across 2 that has renounced. So I often get the question, and my advice is generally don't do it unless you have no links to the US or your kids do not also have US passports, because then we're just going to renounce at one place and then we're going to have the tax issue at the next generation. And so it's something definitely that should be thought through, and it is onerous, long, painful process. So generally not our recommendation. But for some, they decide to go that route. But I think the context is this idea of, as we talked about a couple of times here, the only certainty specifically today is change is a certainty. And we are seeing that in the UK. We've seen that in many of the popular jurisdictions where families have often sort of gathered or set up a residency for their kids. And so that change is kind of driving people to wanting to have these different footprints, including kind of all three layers. So residency, potential citizenship, structures, private banking, wealth, like pieces of real estate, etc., so that they have that optionality across all the different layers. And, often we've had clients where, you and the team have been great resources in terms of mapping out what are the residency options, how does this look, and then working with tax advisors around all the jurisdictions, trying to piece together what is kind of a comprehensive solution. What does this mean? And then how do we then structure wealth, often for thinking through privacy, asset protection. There are places that you may want to live for lifestyle, but you may not want to be showing your level of wealth because there can be security issues to that. And so, it's I think a lot of people are curious about it. I think often it's a journey of really mapping out all the implications of this, be it tax, be it kind of how to operate and live in different places. And then what I like to say to people is I'm interested a little bit in terms of the conversations you have with families, which is, for me, I've lived in many different places around the world, and my kids have been raised in different places, and I've greatly enjoyed it, and I think it's an amazing experience. But it's a lifestyle decision, and at first, we can make more money, we can't make more time is one of my favorite things. And it's kind of, specifically if you're a generationally wealthy family, it's thinking through where you're actually going to be spending this time, where's your family going to be spending this time, and then yes, of course, how can I have some of these other enhancements around tax consequences of living in a location, some of the privacy aspect that might come with it, or just having this plan B idea that the US goes one direction. I may want to have Europe as an option, or may want to have New Zealand as an option, which I know is popular as kind of an ABC sort of framing for specifically significant wealth. But I'm interested in kind of the conversations, having that with a family in terms of thinking through all the different lenses that comes into making this type of decision.
Yeah, it's so interesting. That thing that you brought up about, people wanting to hold money in different parts of the world. This comes up a lot in my conversations. I
Yeah,
mean, they think I can help them open Swiss bank accounts or whatever, which I can't. So that's why I must call you. But um,
sure.
but what I do is, like, to some extent, a diversification of asset strategy, because in many cases you do have to open a bank account. This is a way to open a bank account in another country, which can often be difficult to do. And in some cases, you could be moving, large sums of money, like 3 million to New Zealand. But I know that, the return that you're getting through an investment migration kind of investment strategy is not the same as if you were just investing money. I mean, you have to see the
Sure.
return as getting either the permanent residency or the citizenship. And then on top of it, hopefully you're going to get your capital back with some return as well. The other thing too, which I think is an interesting complement between what the two of us do when you have clients that are buying real estate in other parts of the world. Well, first of all, it could qualify them for a residency. They may not realize it, but it's good to always figure out, like, if I'm buying a home in Greece, oh, I could gain residency rights by doing that. But if you are buying real estate, do you want to make sure that you have residency rights? Because think back to the pandemic. This is really what spurred Americans first being interested in this. They had all these vacation homes in other parts of the world, and they couldn't get in there because they didn't have residency rights. And the US passport had been blocked because of the pandemic. And so if you are buying real estate and there is a residency path, you might want to get it, just so that you're going to have guaranteed access to the property.
This is really highlighting how citizenship or residency is connected to these other pieces, and how those pieces are kind of all in relationship together. And I think that, as I'm listening to this, or I'm imagining being in the shoes of, like, either the next generation or maybe somebody who's, like, quickly come into this wealth, like an athlete or an entertainer, like, this is quite an overwhelming web, if you will, of connected pieces. And I think it's easy. Like, you hear, stories of clients who are getting second opinions on their paperwork from attorneys because, like, in all of this complexity, like, something was lost. And I'm curious to hear how you look at, I mean, Judi, I heard you say, like, there's there's, even once you get past the point of getting the residency or the citizenship, like there is, kind of a maintenance factor, or relooking at it every 3 years, or things you literally have to do for this thing to still be working. And then, Sune, you're talking about, the structures and the jurisdictions and how these interact. And I'm thinking to myself, like, does that work start before the application for the residency? Does that stuff happen after? Is it during? Is it all of it? Like, how can you kind of break this down for somebody like who's specifically either next gen, an athlete, or an entertainer?
So, I mean, we don't charge for consultation. So I have so many interesting conversations with really fascinating people. And, the first thing is to sort of understand what their objectives are. And they may be short-term objectives and long-term objectives. And who do they want to have some sort of investment migration strategy for? And then we start like diving into the programs and what would it take and how long would it take for me to get to the end result, and how much would it cost, and who could I cover on this? And um, usually over the course of time, people will decide either yes, there is a program or programs that appeal to them, or maybe no, but at least they know how long it would take. And maybe in 6 months or 8 months, maybe they're waiting for election, or maybe they're waiting for the sale of a business or something else. They know at least if they want to put something in place, what's going to be involved and how long it's going to take. But if they decide they want to do something, then they have a complete understanding of what's involved, both in terms of what's going to have to be produced. I like to make the analogy we're like an accountant. Like, you can't call an accountant and say, do my taxes. You have to send information to the accountant to be able to do the taxes. And so we need to be able to let our clients know what's going to be required. I mean, sometimes, people hear Caribbean citizenship, they think they're just signing on a dotted line. And no, it's actually like one of the more laborious processes, as Sune knows, because we've done it for a few of his clients. Like, you cannot believe some of the things that you have to produce. You need medical tests, HIV test. You need, in some countries, they want to see source of wealth, birth certificate, marriage certificate, police reports. So the clients will have work to do, but what we do is try and make it as easy as possible. So explaining how to get the birth certificates, how to get the police reports, how to get certain things certified, etc. But we're with them along the whole way. And if there is future requirements, so for example, in the Caribbean, Antigua says you're going to get a passport for 5 years, but you can't renew it unless you've visited the country for at least 5 consecutive days by that 5-year mark. So we're reminding our clients, your passport is going to be expiring. Don't forget, you need to do your 5 days. We have a full concierge team. So we arrange travel for all our clients for appointments for biometrics or for renewals or anything that they need in terms of travel related to their program or outside of the program. And then we stay in touch with our clients. Babies are born that need to get added to the program. People get married. People get divorced. So it's an ongoing relationship that we build with them. So we're there for the ride.
Yeah, that obviously resonates. I mean, we live in a world where we spin up many plates for clients because there's, we get to solve across what we type how to own structurally, and that often have multi-jurisdictional components to it. Obviously, then depending on assets, that can be active businesses and real estate that are somewhat more landlocked. And then you got liquid wealth, be it digital assets or be it traditional securities, etc. And then you kind of got family dynamics, which are dynamic in their own sense, as Judi just outlined. And then you got changes in all layers, so like tax law changes specifically currently, and a lot of noise as well around that. That then you then have to reassess all structures in the context of what if this comes into law, because risk management is not about thinking about just what is the rules of the land right now, but also what might be the rules of the land. And so you at least have to map out and kind of scope it out. And then if you have multi jurisdictions, then you have to think about all of those. And so the idea, or the times perhaps where people felt like they could do some estate planning and put that stack of papers in a drawer and not worry about it for another decade, or, think about citizenship in a more permanent setting, or obviously portfolios have always been somewhat more dynamic, at least in the perception of people. But for us, it's very much the truth that these are constantly in movement or in motion. And if the more complex your wealth and family and your jurisdictional footprint is, you're going to have to understand all of those components and understand how they interact. It's really systems thinking. It's not just having this idea of one or two pieces. You have to understand how they interact. And that's also true specifically of tax code. Specifically for U.S. persons, where we have always U.S. tax. And then the question becomes, what else do we step into if you do want to spend X amount of period of time in France or wherever it might be? And I think it only speaks, we're only going to see more and more of this. And I'm interested, we spoke about some of the dynamics you see in your business, but we have this massive wealth transition on the way, which means money is moving to younger people. I think my experience working with them is that they're much more global, not in the sense that I want to go and spend X time in this place. I want to start a business. I want to do some philanthropic activity in this place. And my year looks a lot more like a footprint that is global. And you can't really just build with this one jurisdiction mindset anymore. It's often this hub and spoke, where we try and build sort of what should ideally be relatively permanent core structures that holds the wealth. And in the context of residency or citizenship, those are obviously some of those building blocks that ideally has a long longevity attached to them. And then we got these spokes that might be, hey, for the next 6 months at that home I bought in Bali, I want to go and be there. And so we need to think through that piece. But you're ending up with this trying to create some permanent sort of building blocks, and then just understanding you're going to have to be pretty flexible on all these other pieces. And I think that will only be increasing, and more is going to be demanded from it. And the external environment is going to be one of constant change. I think, again, in one of the more recent reports, I think they were talking about these two pressures in one direction, which is I think we're starting to see the nation states become increasingly threatened by wealth, and there's obviously populism within, which leads to very noisy politics. And then you got this increasingly larger and larger wealth group that is increasingly more and more global in nature, while these nation states are trying to enforce sort of boundaries on what is possible. And it's kind of two different objects that are going to meet. And, again, trying to think through what that looks like when you're serving clients who are wanting more and more flexibility and optionality in a world that is trying to constrain those two things. I think we're in for an interesting decade or maybe two ahead of us in that context, which probably keep you and me busy talking about options. But anyway, I'm interested. That was kind of a long monologue, but I'm interested in kind of your thinking in terms of kind of what does it look like going forward, and maybe also in the terms of kind of what are potential jurisdictions, because I know your world changes constantly with, you talked about Europe pulling back opportunity sets. How are you guys navigating, trying to think through what might be good options 5 years from now?
Yeah. So really good question. We have this government advisory line of business, so we create a lot of these programs. And I can tell you that they are very busy, the government advisory line of business. So partially because this is such a huge source of foreign direct investment for countries. And countries need money to pay down debts and to invest in infrastructure and invest in the lives of their citizens. But there is that interesting dynamic that you referenced, which is that sometimes these programs get blamed for causing dissatisfaction among locals, and then it becomes a political battle. So, for example, in Portugal, you used to be able to qualify for the Portugal Golden Visa via the purchase of real estate, and the Golden Visa was blamed for skyrocketing housing prices. And so the government many years ago changed it and said, okay, but you can't buy in any of the popular areas. So Porto, Lisbon, the Algarve, can't buy. Most of our clients were investing in hotel projects. So that was not affecting housing prices. These were hotels. But there still was like this significant anger among Portuguese locals that somehow the Golden Visa was impacting their access to fair housing. And so Portugal just said, forget it. Nobody can do anything related to real estate anymore to qualify for the Golden Visa, even though they had years before eliminated purchasing or anything that was going to affect local housing. But it's this perception that I think governments are often having to balance between the benefits that these programs bring to the countries and whether they're going to be able to be reelected because of the way that their constituents feel about them. Similarly, in Spain, you used to be able to qualify for the Golden Visa by investing $500,000 in real estate. And literally overnight, the president of Spain closed it because of the anger among Spanish locals, how it impacted the housing price, which it probably fairly did. So it's like a balancing act constantly between the program and the benefit and how it might impact from a political perspective or for the life of the citizens. I definitely think in Europe we're seeing a tightening with regard to migration in general. I think, I referenced this with regard to the visa-free access that the Caribbean passports have to allow Caribbean passport holders to be able to enter Europe. I don't know that that's always going to remain. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fundamental philosophy that Europe has right now with regard to migration. Um, Programs are always going to change, they're always going to close, but they're always going to be new ones opening. I think the next big one that's coming is Argentina, which is rumored to have a citizenship program potentially as soon as the fourth quarter of this year. I think it's going to be very interesting. I think LATAM in general is very interesting. I know our government advisory line of business is very active there. So I think we're going to start to see more programs that are available. Most will probably be residency. I think citizenship, there's just not a lot of routes to citizenship. I think we're going to see more citizenship by merit initiatives. So I think that's another thing to look out for.
Yeah, I think I'd also say that for anybody listening who has a feeling that like citizenship might be possible for them due to ancestry, and like maybe you've been told no by a lawyer before, like that doesn't mean that it's still not possible. And it is always important to get a second opinion. And also I know that you were referencing how there has to be like some documents or some evidence of natural that they were a citizen or your ancestors, but it's also amazing how the lawyers can come up with finding documents that you didn't know existed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Ancestry is interesting. Like some programs are expanding access to it. Canada just made some announcements that they were going to expand to future generations. It's still a little unclear, actually, how successful these people are going to be if their relatives did naturalize in another country and renounce. And this is the kind of thing we're going to have to wait. We're going to have to watch different test cases go through now
Yeah.
that the law has changed and see who is granted and who is not.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, we saw Italy really pull back in terms of who could qualify via ancestry. So it's a lot of uneven developments
Right.
with regard to that. But I mean, as I said, if you think you might be entitled to it, I always think it's worth looking into. And you are right. There are genealogists and there are researchers that sometimes can get documents on your behalf. I know there was one document, I didn't have my grandparents' marriage certificate, but the lawyers were very easily able to
They
get it.
found it.
Town that they were married in. When you're from a family in Ukraine, it might be harder because things may have been
Right.
destroyed. But yeah, just because you don't have it doesn't mean you can't get it. But it's interesting how many people say to me, but I'm not really sure of their last name, or I'm not really sure of the town they lived in. Like it becomes very difficult to
Yeah,
find
I know.
documents that don't at least have some information.
Yeah, you have to have kind of a driving force you're going on a bit of an investigation. Before we're kind of closing in on time, but I wanted to bring up Canada actually, and Canadian families. I know that there is, just from on the ground kind of conversations that I've had, that there is actually a very real fear among Canadian next generation and families of the United States invading them, for example. And then I was listening to, again, I've referenced your podcast that I listened to, where you said that Canada was actually, before Henley existed in the United States, you all were in Canada. Like that was the first North American location.
Well,
So
yeah.
was that right?
Yeah, well, we have like 70 offices around the world. And so we
Yeah.
do have a significant presence in Canada. We've just expanded into the United States. Initially, we were handling all our American clients through Canada because there wasn't that many of them. Now we have
Yeah.
like 10 offices here. But Canada's an interesting country that I get asked about a lot because a lot of people think it'll be a really easy place to go to. It's
Mm.
just hard. I mean, Ancestry could conceivably be a new route now that they've expanded that. But in terms of investment migration opportunities to relocate to Canada, it's very difficult. Montreal is the only country that has a citizenship by investment program. You need to be fluent in French. You need to relocate for at least 8 months in the first year. And their visas, in order for you to renew them, because you're granted for 5 years, you have to live in Canada for at least 2 of the 5 years. Most of my clients really don't want to relocate. They just want to know they can. So Canada's tough. And in the
Yeah,
same
and I guess I'm thinking for the Canadian family who wants to have options. And interesting, right? As I'm hearing that there are Americans who want to go to Canada, and then the Canadians are being like, I don't know if you want to come here. We're scared. We want to go. So, speaking on behalf of or for families in Canada.
Yeah, I think the
Yeah.
interesting thing with Canadians historically, in my experience with working with Canadian clients, is that they do not have the US tax framework. And so they actually have quite
Exactly.
they obviously have relatively high tax at home. And some would argue that that's attractive because they're building infrastructure and there's healthcare and stuff. But obviously they are somewhat, a little bit like some Europeans seek to get away from they actually want to be selective with the tax jurisdiction, which is not viable for US persons. And so there is quite a lot of Canadian either at their retirement stage or if they're building companies who want to basically take advantage of the fact of repositioning themselves in terms of tax jurisdiction, which then means often looking at some of the Caribbean or some of like Switzerland or some of these places, which again is also popular with European families that, I'm Scandinavian background, and so Switzerland is certainly much more interesting if you're building businesses and wealth of significant scale than living in Denmark or Sweden, for example. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. I've had a couple Canadian clients that I've worked. One, a crypto guy, he wanted to go to UAE for a better tax strategy. The key is you have to go there. I mean, you usually have to be 183 days in that country. So it's a lifestyle, as you said. It's a lifestyle decision. Where can I go that's, going to be an alternative tax residency that I'm going to be happy living in for at least 6 months a year? But Dubai is often a go-to. Malta has some really interesting structures, but often a go-to. But you're right. That's something that a Canadian has that an American doesn't, and that is the ability to get an alternative tax residency.
I wanted to hit one point, which is again kind of client use case that we actually worked on together. To your point about the Caribbean passports, so obviously there's been more from an emerging market background, particularly places like India and other places where it can be difficult to get some ability to travel freely. Often if they got special talents, they would go to the US, they would go to London either to go to university or because they wanted to build startup businesses or to join startup businesses, often or large companies in the technology space. But then either they end up with a U.S. residency that allows them to enjoy all the wonders of the U.S., but when they want to go and do something different, then they're back in that very long queue to get visas to different parts of the world, be it to go to Singapore for a conference or go to Europe or whatever it might be for the summer. And so I think, again, that's an increased use case that I'm seeing just because I have people asking me about this, and they may have had gone to places that were more easy to access, like Dubai, and maybe starting to question whether that's where they want to raise a family. And so in terms of we've spoken a lot about the relevant to the US person, but I'm interested a little bit in terms of sort of the emerging market family that increasingly is looking both for travel option, actual relocation, etc. How Henley might work with that type of client.
Yeah. So we have 70 offices around the world. So whether I handle a client that's living in another part of the world, or
I prefer you. So Judi is my go-to because he knows the stuff. But
thank you, Sune. So it's interesting. First question is, are they planning to give up the citizenship they have? Because like India, China don't allow for dual citizenship. Now, sometimes people from those countries will still get something like a Caribbean passport, but they're not doing Malta because Malta's publishing the names of everybody who gets a citizenship. So that's a factor that has to be considered. If they want to maintain their existing citizenship, I happen to think if their key is Schengen access, we should get a residency for them in Europe. I think it's much more guaranteed than these Caribbean passports right now. I'm just worried about Europe and whether they're going to always enable people to get into Europe like they have in the past. We're going to have electronic visas coming soon to U.S. persons as well as Caribbean people, and they could write the algorithm so anyone from these Caribbean countries don't get those electronic visas. So I think residency is a great way to improve mobility. You can get a Maltese residency very affordably, very quickly, that gives you Schengen access. if that's all that they want. If they want a second passport, that's also going to enable them to get into other countries. I think the Caribbean passports are a great strategy for that, because if maybe you have Europe, maybe you don't, but you still have lots of other countries. But I do have actually two clients right now who are Indian, who had moved to Dubai, and now they want to add something else. They just, because of what's going on with the war, they feel like that's not sufficient to just have that. And we still have plenty of people coming into the US with EB5.
Yeah. Yeah, I spend a lot of time on the West Coast, and that's obviously a very dynamic place, specifically Silicon Valley right now with the AI and kind of entrepreneurship taking off again. And so, again, the US has always been super dynamic, and the politics have always been somewhat noisy. And for many people who are in emerging market, they're used to the noisy politics, and they're quite happy for the
They can't
entrepreneurial
believe
opportunity.
Americans want a plan B. They're like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
This is where my
So
dream
yeah,
is.
I get to see both sides, because we have a lot of American clients, and increasingly they wanted the plan B and wanting to have wealth overseas, and then I'm getting kind of more the emerging market type client, and they're like, well, the US is still interesting to us, and so to your point, it's super dynamic. I know we're rounding out. I can see Claire's giving me the eye, but I think the one thing is, just to round out, I think it's important to take away, specifically anyone who wants citizenship, and specifically if it's ancestry or otherwise, the window seems to be closing a little bit on that path. So people probably is going to want to push the pedal to the metal if that's something that they want to pursue. If they feel they have a pathway for ancestry, the best day to plant the tree is 30 years ago or today. And I think specifically my take from what I'm seeing from my seat is that might not be something that is readily available for very long. And then it just seems that there's obviously a lot of new dynamic opportunities. And so it's just staying abreast of what things like Argentina or some, New Zealand that kind of closed down a little bit, a lot of it, and then they ramped it back up again.
They
And
redid
so,
it a year ago, April. They brought in $3 billion, 40% of that from the US.
Good for them.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I have to close out this conversation,
Okay.
but I think that's good, because that means that maybe we can have another. For anybody listening, if you have any questions or topics that we didn't get to today, like, please reach out. We look at all of your feedback. I'm sure that Judi would welcome any questions as well. And that's it for today. But thank you so much, Judi. This was lovely
My
to
pleasure.
reconnect and chat with
Great
you.
to see you guys.
Great to catch up again, Judy.
All
Thanks.
right. Take care.